This essay is not going to be like anything you've ever written before. It's not going to have a nice, neat little introduction, 3 body paragraphs, and a conclusion. No, narratives are stories. They can't be confined to 5 paragraphs. No, they kind of meander. It's what makes them interesting, as opposed to the standard academic essay that may be a little less interesting. What genre is this? What type of writing? We could call it creative nonfiction. We could call it personal essay. Now, a personal essay should start with a question, but it's a question you want to find out the answer to. So as you start with the inquiry question that you've got, don't start out with the answer. Don't start out knowing what you want to say. Because if you can come up with the answer like that, chances are anybody else could come up with the same answer, which means that your essay won't be terribly interesting to them. Joan Didion, who is an essayist, she says, I write entirely to find out what I'm thinking, what I'm looking at, what I see, and what it means. And that's what I want you to do in this. You're choosing a question. I gave you a few questions. I said, if you've got another question you want to ask, check with me. I'm happy to consider that, and I'll give you the go-ahead or not if I think it's a good question. These are the questions that Callie started out with. What is the role of literacy in my life? Why does literacy matter to me? What does it mean to me? And so she set out to answer a question like that. She used to come into my classroom, or once she came into my classroom, and she did this presentation, gave me the slide deck, and now I share it with my students. This is the process she has. And if you're looking at it and you go, that's not linear, that's not a step 1, step 2, step 3. No, this is circular. You start in one place and then you go back, and then it goes back and forth. It's recursive. But it does start with the inquiry question. And let's see where we go with this. So this was how she did this. Why does literacy matter to me? It allows me to read. I have access to information. I have access to a knowledge of a world beyond myself. This is actually pretty cool. But any of us could have given this answer. And if that had been what we read, her story wouldn't have been so riveting. And she knew that. So she asked the question again, going a little bit deeper. It gave her the power. Literacy matters to her because it gives her the power to control ideas. When we write, we can control the way people understand things. It gives her the power to learn, and it gives her the power to listen to people and learn from them. So that's a little bit more interesting. But she went a little bit deeper. She's recognizing that these are literacies. She asked, these are different types of literacies. She can watch something and learn from people what people are doing, because we communicate they communicate different ideas as they're doing things. She can understand new things from storytelling and media, internet, television. She realized that literacy matters to her because it gives her the power to surrender and recover. I know that's a little complicated. Once she'd written down these ideas, and gone a little bit deeper with her ideas. She started asking new questions like, when did my literacy form? And what did I read? And what stories was I told? And what did I watch? And what did I listen to? And um, the answer to this question, when did my literacy form, is a little complicated because um, Callie has dyslexia. So she didn't learn how to read and she could barely write until late in the third grade. And even then, she memorized words as pictures. And so if she saw a word that looked like CAT, she knew that meant cat, but she wasn't sounding it out because there was a jumble of letters and they would turn different ways depending on how they were next to each other. And so literacy was very complicated to her with regards to reading. And when she was a child, I think teachers didn't understand that as well. And so they weren't terribly helpful. They often assumed that she was lazy or she wasn't trying. And to complicate matters, so she didn't get the help she needed from teachers. But when she started reading, she, like uh, she she did read and she enjoyed reading because of that power it gave her to learn. And so she asked herself this next question: what did I read? You may have read some of these books. I remember Swiss Family Robinson and Island of the Blue Dolphins. And she also read other types of books, wilderness living, survival skills, edible plants. And so, like she asked herself, okay, so these are the types of books I read. What did they have in common? Well, they had feral children, survival stories, independence, agency. That's a little weird that this was her main theme. Um, and so that brought up a new question. Why was I so fascinated with these themes? And she didn't know, but she kept asking questions because she was told a lot of stories. She was told stories by watching television, The Muppet Show, Charlie's Angels, What's Happening. But she was also told stories by family members. Her grandmother, as you know, was a very interesting person. And her grandmother actually traveled by rail, riding the rails, sneaking onto trains like hobos used to do back in the day. She traveled all the way from Oklahoma to California. And that's when she was gang raped. And that was a story that her grandmother told her. Her mother was a bit of a hippie. And so her mother told her those kinds of stories also. Um, but her mother also told her the story of almost being raped, being pulled out of a bedroom window, of domestic violence. And so Callie Linfor was exposed to stories about survival and about the need to survive. And so it makes sense that she was fascinated with survival and stories of survival, because she was raised in this environment where she felt the need to survive. She also asked herself what settings mattered, like school, her house, her television, her library. Who mattered to her literacy? Obviously, her mom, her grandmother, the school librarian, the city librarian who gave her books without judging her the way her teachers did, and her first college writing teacher. And as she was going through this brainstorming process, she realized that her she remembered her first college writing teacher was the last victim of the Hillside Strangler, and she survived. Now, this was the first that Linfor had ever thought about the Hillside Strangler in this. But that prompted her to remember that when she was watching television, Before the Muppets came on, she watched the news. She knew the story of the Hillside Strangler. She hadn't thought about that up until now because she was so focused on literacy stories and the most obvious answers. And this one just came to her as she started thinking about her college writing teacher who mattered so much, who assigned writing assignments where the writing mattered. And she realized that was part of her desire, her need to feel like she was surviving. And that helped her organize her essay. The most obvious stuff doesn't come to us right away. We have to dig deep and ask questions. She also asked, who am I writing this essay to? She was writing to San Diego County writing teachers. You are not writing to me. You are writing to your peers. First year, second year students at San Diego State. She asked herself, what does her audience think about literacy? They thought about it, you just reading and writing in standard English. They didn't think about literacy being another language, or literacy being another dialect, or literacy being storytelling, or literacy being interrupted with dyslexia. And that prompted her to think about how does what I think about literacy, remember for her, literacy is survival. How is it different? It's survival, something her teachers hadn't communicated. And she says all literacies count. If you're not used to speaking in the standard accepted written English, your literacy counts. If you communicate in another language, more than one language, that counts. Storytelling counts. Literacies we learn from our families count. All literacies count. And then she thought, what parts of my identity matter to this essay? Well, she was really, really poor. Something that her teachers didn't truly understand how poverty affects learning. She was dyslexic, so learning to read was difficult. She had to find other ways to communicate. She's a woman, and that matters. And so these parts of her identity matter. She also had to think about what parts of my identity matter to my audience, because maybe those mattered less. They mattered to her story, but they might not have mattered to her audience. And so the fact that she's a poet and a writing teacher, that matters. And so by adding those identities, in addition to the identities she was thinking about that she thought mattered, she was able to adapt to her audience and her purpose and achieve her goals. Back to that jumble of the process. You can see how she came up with a surprising story that pulled us in, evoked emotions, made us think, haunted me. I am her primary audience. And she changed this story and some other things too, changed the way I teach writing. So she truly did adapt to audience and purpose. Now, do you need to do any research other than what's assigned? Yeah, research helps you get the details right. Remember, Callie was a very little girl watching the Hillside Strangler on the news. It didn't even dawn on her. She didn't even remember that until she went through the brainstorming process. And so she had to do some research on the Hillside Strangler to remember the details that mattered, that make this story come alive for us. She had to do some research on stories that she might have read because honestly, I don't remember. I read hundreds of books when I was in elementary school. Do I remember them all? No. And so she had to go back and think about that. That was part of her brainstorming process. Research helps you support your stories, but it's not the starting point. So that's all I've got. Let me finish this up and post it.